Hey, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening for our latest digital talk. My name is Jim Ambuski. I'm at the Washington Library Center for Digital History, where I also have the good fortune of hosting our podcast, Conversations at the Washington Library. And if you do us a favor this evening, you can check out our podcast at our new website, www.georgewashingtonpodcast.com. There you're going to find all of our episodes, including our latest, which is a great episode. It's with Dr. Carolyn Eastman of Virginia Commonwealth University. And we look at the strange genius of Mr. O in the early republic. So be sure to check us out at georgewashingtonpodcast.com and subscribe to Conversations wherever you get your favorite programs, particularly at Apple Podcasts or Google or whatnot. Now, and also, I would encourage you to follow the library on Twitter and Instagram at GW Books. There you can find our latest podcast episodes, information about past and future live streams, and of course, access to all of our digital resources so that you can learn more about early America, the American Revolution, and George Washington from the comfort of your home. I'm very excited about tonight's event. I'm looking forward to it a great deal, talking with Dr. Michael Hattem about the importance of the past in the American Revolution. Before we get to that conversation, though, just a couple of programming notes. Please be sure to join us back here on Thursday, April 29th at 7 p.m. My colleague, Dr. Kevin Butterfield, will be speaking to historian and author Dr. Stephen Brown about a new book on George Washington's inaugural address. And then join us in May, on May the 19th to be precise, for the final lecture in our Michelle Smith lecture series featuring R.B. Bernstein on the education of John Adams. You can find more information about our past and our future live stream talks, including the two just mentioned, by going to mountvernon.org/GW Digital Talks. All righty. Now, as I said, we've got a great program tonight. And speaking of education, if we all learn right from the Declaration of Independence that Americans reminded their British brethren that they had of the circumstances of their immigration to what became the United States. And that reference is a vague reference to Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration, in which he claimed that American colonists had settled North America with no help from Great Britain whatsoever. Now, of course, as any good historian will tell you, that's a false claim. But the fact that Jefferson can make that, and did make that, speaks to how early Americans reimagined both their British and their colonial pasts during the revolutionary moment. Tonight, we're very lucky to have someone who can help us explain how the past shaped the American Revolution. Dr. Michael Hattem is an associate director of the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute. He's also a fellow podcaster. He's a contributor and producer of the Junto Cast, which is a podcast about early America. And he's got a great new YouTube series called History Talks, which invites historians to talk about historical content in an accessible way. And I just learned this just a few minutes ago. He is a two-time Washington Library Research Fellow, and we hope to make it 3 someday, and we'll get a three-peat out of Dr. Michael Hattem. But let's go ahead and welcome him to the show. Michael, thanks so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
Oh, and I'm here in my home in Charlottesville during these COVID times. Where might you be this evening?
I am in sunny Western Illinois, in Galesburg, Illinois, which is a small town about 3 hours west of Chicago that was established by a group of evangelical abolitionists from New York State.
Oh, wow. I didn't really realize that. That's really cool. Let's talk about that sometime. We'll talk about a different kind of history this evening, but I'd love to learn more about that in the future. Well, thanks again for joining us, Michael. I'm delighted. I love the book. We're here to talk about your book, Past and Prologue, Politics and Memory of the American Revolution, which is a terrific book from Yale University Press. And before we get started, I just want to remind the folks out there in the audience that they'll have the opportunity to ask questions of you later on in the second half of the program. So if folks would be so inclined and would please put your questions in the chat function for YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, wherever you're watching this evening, we'd love to know what's on your mind, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. Michael, let's get started. And I want to start with a very provocative statement, actually, you make in the first 3 pages of the book. Actually, you say, memory lives in the shadow cast by history. And I have to confess that reminded me of my favorite line from Star Trek, which is "Time is the fire in which we burn." And so I was hoping that we might take a moment to unpack what you mean by memory lives in the shadow cast by history and how that relates to the larger project here.
Yeah, so I think I was trying to come up with a sort of analogy for the relationship between history and memory. And I think that that's really actually a good place for us to start our conversation. I mean, we all know that history has multiple meanings, right? It can mean everything that's happened in the past. It can refer to a sort of disciplined way of writing about the past. So like history as a subject, right? But memory is different from history, but it's not separate from it. And that's where I think the sort of the metaphor comes from. So memory or historical memory is basically a narrative about the past that is constructed for specific purposes and imbued with specific meanings, right? So it has a relationship to history or the past, but the ambiguity of the past itself, in my mind, that's the shadow that's cast by history. That ambiguity allows memory to basically be whatever it wants, right? That's especially the case with the memory of the American Revolution. Why disparate groups can make such varying interpretations of the American Revolution. That's something that's gone on throughout our entire history. So basically, I would say also that the memory does not rely on accuracy or facts in the way that we think that history in the 21st century does. Instead, it's sort of the power of a historical memory really comes from its ability to connect with people on an emotional level, and in many cases to sort of confirm previously held beliefs.
In the 18th century, then, what did history and memory mean to colonial Americans as they thought about their identity as British subjects and then later American revolutionaries?
Yeah, so I mean, memory is not really a term used in the way that I'm using it now in the 18th century, but I would say that generally speaking, history in the 18th century was really embedded into colonial culture in a variety of ways. And in the book, I use this idea of history culture to try to better understand the colonial society's relationship to the past. And what I mean by history culture, it's sort of just a fancy term, really, for looking at all representations or uses of the past in a given society. So instead of, say, just looking at the historical works that were produced, right? So instead of just looking at what I call histories of, I went beyond that to look at how people represented the past in a variety of print forms and genres and things like that. So I looked at things like, the political writings in the 1760s and 1770s, of course, but also things like almanacs and textbooks and children's readers and poetry and fiction and all these things. So it's all about trying to get a better sense of how people in the late colonial period, say the mid 18th century, how they related to and understood the past. And so part of what I found was, if we're thinking in terms of like consumption, I found that the reading of history, like reading generally, grew significantly in the decades before the revolution. And that was primarily among elites, but not only. I have a story about a relatively poor farmer in Maryland who, when he died, left behind a cow, his Bible, and one volume of a history of England. Right. And I was, in preparation for today, I was looking through my notes about George Washington. And it turns out there was actually the purchase of an imported copy of Tobias Smollett's History of England in 1763 that really spurred him to first take inventory of his library,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so colonial Americans, they were reading more history than ever before. And they primarily read two kinds of history. There was ecclesiastical history, so church history,
Mm-hmm.
and then there was civil history, what we might think of as political history. And one of the most popular works of the time was Paul Rapin's History of England. And he was this French writer, a French Huguenot, but he wrote this really popular History of England in the 1720s, 1730s is when it's translated. And it's a very Whiggish history. It sort of, it portrays the Glorious Revolution as this fundamental moment where the balance of the English Constitution gets restored after the tyrannical Stuart monarchs of the 17th century. And this sort of goes back to what I was talking about. That argument, that interpretation really fit many colonists' political perspectives. And so, they saw the Glorious Revolution, much like Americans have long seen the American Revolution, as this sort of foundational event that, set the foundation in both principles and institutions for sort of future national greatness, right? And so you can see how even in the 18th century, their reading habits, they're already inclined to favor historical interpretations that bolster these ideas that they've previously had, right?
Yeah, and so as they're consuming these ideas then and looking to things like the Glorious Revolution as a foundational moment, does that reinforce their sense of British identity in the years before the American Revolution and help them feel a kinship with Britons living in the British Isles?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it's really one of the most important sort of connections, I think, for colonists in the 18th century back to, what they would think of as the mother country, as Britain in the 18th century. They're separated, from Britain by 3,000 miles of ocean, right? Mm-hmm. And the history of England, and specifically the history of the Glorious Revolution and how they understood that, at least, is a real sort of cultural lifeline, right, for colonists. It gives them a way to participate in some sense or to feel at least some connection to the political culture in Britain itself, right? Mm-hmm. But then also there are ways in which, like, as happened with many sort of intellectual threads and ideas, those ideas and interpretations start to change, as they make their way through this colonial society 3,000 miles away. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I should say, that I don't want to give the impression that, most of your colonists in the 18th century had some real in-depth knowledge of the past, of history. Sure. Their knowledge of the past was really what you might say a sort of mile wide and an inch deep, right? They didn't need to know a lot of, say, specifics about the Glorious Revolution to know what it meant to them, mm-hmm. right? And that's really not that different from people today. Many we know from studies that are published every couple of years that Americans typically don't know very much about their history, right? Sure. But at the same time, they have these very emotional connections to events in the past, like the American Revolution or the mm-hmm. Civil War, right? So a sort of depth of knowledge is really not required for people to develop these emotional connections to the past.
And you mentioned consumption as being a very important part of how they develop these emotional attachments. Are the works that they're reading, are those being printed in the colonies themselves, or are those coming from the mother country and kind of reinforcing that bridge?
Yeah. So, part of the transition that the book goes through is the sort of first half of the book is about what I call a colonial history culture, right? Mm-hmm. To a transition to a national history culture after the revolution. And one of the reasons why it's a decidedly colonial history culture is because most of that historical content that they have access to, especially if we think about the books for specifically, all of that is imported from England, right? And that, of course, limits the number of people who could possibly have access to it, right? I mean, it's limited largely to elites who can afford to import books. Though before the revolution, we begin to see, the rise of social libraries, right? And this is where, people in some town who, come together and they pool their money together to set up a social library where, they can each borrow books, and by pooling their money together, they put in an order for books, in England to have them delivered. And so I did a lot of tracing of these early social libraries, of which the Library Company in Philadelphia is one, right? That's probably the most well-known example. But, I looked at the catalogs, the early catalogs of these libraries. The Redwood is another one, right? In Providence. And, what I found was a very large percentage of the books in their holdings, especially early on, were these works of history, And I found the same when I looked in the holdings of some of the more prominent colleges in the period, at Harvard College, at Yale College, and I found, I found that the percentage of historical works in these libraries growing over the decades leading up to the revolution. So, we have elites who can buy books, but we have, elites and some maybe aspiring middling class people who go to college who have access to books. And then we have regular people who are forging their own ways to access the histories that they wanted to read through these social libraries. And after the revolution, they really explode. I think in the 1780s, there's almost 100 social libraries established in Connecticut alone.
Wow.
To give you a sense of how much that the reading of and access to history explodes after the revolution.
That's pretty fascinating. I've had the good fortune of participating in a project that looks at a library history, and reading lists like that are just fantastic. You can learn so much from what's on people's minds and whatnot.
Yeah, because they have such small resources, right? I mean, if you can only afford to, if you're starting a social library and you can only afford to buy, this small set amount of books, then you're going to buy the ones that there's the most demand for among the people that you're doing this with. So there's a lot to be gleaned from that. What I also found too was that it's easy to underestimate the amount of history that people were reading if we think beyond just specific like history of England or things like that.
Sure.
When they're reading ecclesiastical history, if they're reading church history, then that's its own form of history. But even if they're reading other works, other religious works, or other or texts on a variety of other topics, those works still often incorporated a lot of history into them to be able to tell their stories, right? So history is really in the 18th century, history is it's really all around people. And I argue in the book in chapter 2 that in the period, historical distance is much shorter than it is now. So it's not just that history is all around them, but it also feels closer to them than it does to us. I mean, it's easy our sense of historical distance is inflated, right? Because of technological developments and things like that. But in the 18th century, if you're a farmer, like 98% of the population lived in rural areas, then the basic rhythms of your daily life were not really all that different from your ancestors of 100 or 200 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. And that lent itself to sort of making the past feel more immediate or more intimate, I should say, than maybe it is uh, uh, maybe as intelligible to us in our contemporary context.
So that sense of immediacy, then, is that in part what causes such disruption in thinking about the past, and I think, as you argue in the book, compels them to reassess it when the British government begins to institute a number of reforms like the Stamp Act in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, and it forces a lot of colonial Americans to rethink their relationship, not only in the present but also with the past itself.
Yeah, so absolutely. So in addition, I mean, or part of what I'm talking about when I say the past is all around them, I mean, one of the other factors there is that colonists lived in this common law culture, right? And in the common law, the common law gives real legal weight and authority to the ideas of precedent and custom and tradition, right? And so I refer to this as the authority of the past, right? That colonists felt in the 18th century, and they very much sort of understood, the present through the lens of the past. And so when you get to the imperial crisis in the 1760s, because of that sense of the authority of the past and how invested colonists are in it, and I should say, this is something that they inherited from their ancestors who had come over from England in the 17th century. And part of what complicates things in the 1760s and 1770s is that this idea of the authority of the past had really lost a lot of its power in Britain, right, over the course of the 18th century. And so it creates this sort of cultural difference between them that I think factors in, significantly to the sort of the ways in which they seem to be talking past one another. But what happens is basically because of this sense of the authority of the past, colonists really reacted quite vehemently when Parliament began to pass all this type of unprecedented legislation, right? Trying to reform the administration of the empire. And that's because colonists believed that their relationship to the mother country had already been defined by the precedent and the custom of the last 50 years or so. And so when Parliament passes these unprecedented laws like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, it creates a real sense of anxiety on the part of colonists. And that's because this idea of the authority of the past allowed them to develop expectations, right? Sure. If you know that precedent and custom have this real weight, and you can feel pretty secure that things aren't going to radically change all of a sudden, right? But what happens is when Parliament does start to pass these unprecedented types of legislation, it looks to colonists like they're usurping the authority of the past, right? And in a very real sense, when colonists start to use the phrase unconstitutional, that's effectively what they mean, right? And because if Parliament is not bound by the custom and precedent of the past, how could you possibly predict what they would do, right? And that creates a real sense of instability amongst colonists in the 1760s and 1770s.
Can we look at this a little further and look at it within the context of what we talked about just a moment ago, which is the interpretation of the Glorious Revolution? Yeah. Because it seems to me then that a lot of, not everything, of course, but a lot of the trouble that both sides are having when they're talking past each other is they took different lessons from 1688, and that manifests itself in the 1760s.
Yeah, absolutely. So part of what we see happen in this, I talk about this in the third chapter of the book, is patriots begin, by the end of the 1760s, they begin to start questioning the meaning of the legacy of the Glorious Revolution in new ways, right? So before this, they had understood, like many people in England did, that the Glorious Revolution had, ended the tyranny of the Stuart monarchs of the 17th century, right? And in doing that, it had restored the balance of the Constitution in England, right? And the main way that it did that was basically through this idea of parliamentary supremacy. So, when William III accedes to the throne after the Glorious Revolution, part of the settlement, part of the deal there is that he accepts a more limited prerogative for the monarch, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Parliament's prerogative or authority is expanded, right? And this was throughout the 18th century in England and in the colonies. This was seen as really having reestablished the balance of the Constitution. But when Parliament starts passing these unprecedented legislations in the 1760s, and colonists, including the Declaratory Act, and colonists begin to realize that they have no recourse really beyond Parliament, because the only way to overturn an act of Parliament is by another act of Parliament, right? So there's no way for them to appeal these acts of legislation that they disagree with, and so they start to think about this idea of parliamentary supremacy, which is one of the main legacies of the Glorious Revolution, not as having restored some kind of balance, but instead as having basically just reversed the roles of Parliament and the king, right? And basically creating the circumstances in which Parliament could act as arbitrarily and absolutely as any 17th century monarch, right? Mm-hmm. And I see that in a lot of the writings during the crisis, especially after 1768, in newspapers, pamphlets, broadsides. I mean, if you're reading through, the literature, the resistance literature from that period systematically, like I did for the book, these sort of the term parliamentary supremacy is a real consistent theme throughout the late 1760s and early 1770s, as is this idea of arbitrary power, mm-hmm. And absolute power. And so, all of their thoughts on those ideas and what they meant were absolutely informed by their now sort of shifting understandings of the past.
I assume then that in Great Britain, most people are like, what's the problem?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, partly because in Britain they were not as because they had sort of let go a little bit of this idea of the authority of the past, and especially by the 1760s, the situation in Britain is that they'd come out of the 7 Years' War, right? Come out of basically more than 50 years of war with France and Spain, with the largest empire in the world. And, if it was going to take some new laws in the colonies to, help administer this unprecedented situation, then that seemed to make sense to them, right? When colonists made these arguments based on, the authority of the past, based on ideas of precedent and custom, you see a lot of English writers not just dismissing them, but in a sense, they look at the colonists as sort of as very provincial for sort of still believing in this old, right, this old way of thinking, right? So they sort of come off even more as sort of provincial and maybe even rubish in a sense, right? And that's how the British writers. Many of the British writers sort of took the colonists' arguments, and so I think that had two effects. One, it made it so that they have fundamental different outlooks on what should be able to happen, right? And really fundamental differences in the relationship between the past and the present. But the other thing that it does too is that it allows colonists to begin to see some sense of cultural difference with the mother country, right? Whereas, historians have long argued and assumed that colonists were becoming more British over the course of the 18th century, right? For reasons of consumer culture and other reasons. But this is a moment where colonists could stop and say, wait, maybe we're not as British as we thought we were,
Exactly.
or maybe the British aren't as British as we thought they were. Right?
Who's the real British here?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I want to dive into more of that in just a moment and look at the ways in which history becomes a kind of unifying force amongst these disparate colonists. But I do want to remind the audience out there that, in about 10 minutes or so, we'll turn to your questions. So again, if you have some for Dr. Hattem, please do put those in the chat on Facebook, YouTube, or wherever you find yourself this evening. And we'll be pleased to get to your questions here in just a moment. But Michael, let's talk about that, because we are, talking about, 26, various colonies in North America and the Caribbean. We know that 13 ultimately rebel. And at the moment of the going into the 1760s, 1770s, we're not talking about a unified front, really. We're talking about Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and whatnot. How does then the reimagining or the rethinking of the past then help Americans who are inclined to resist the British find common cause with each other?
Yeah. So part of what starts to happen is they start to create a sense of a shared colonial past, really, for the first time. So before 1760, there's really no sense of some sort of shared colonial past or of some American history, right?
Sure.
That's something that emerges much later. And even just in general terms, colonists in various colonies would probably know more about, say, the history of England than they would know about the history of some other colony, right? But what happens is we start to see this, and I'm tracing this in the book through things like the resolutions, say, against the Stamp Act and against the Townshend Acts that are drafted not just by, say, the Stamp Act Congress, which is a sort of continental body, right? But by people in local towns and counties, and in counties in Virginia and towns in Massachusetts. And one of the themes that becomes really important in not just in the resistance writings, but in these resolutions, has to do with the origins of the colonies, right?
Sure.
And part of that fight is over, who were. They're fighting over questions like, were the colonies, what authority was given to the colonies when they were established, right? Say by whoever was king in the 17th century when a various colony was formed. At whose expense was the colony settled, right? There are all these historical questions, and this act of settlement is really central to so many of the patriot arguments in the imperial crisis. I mean, many of the arguments that we think of that are, that we think of quite commonly are really imbued or informed by these historical interpretations around settlement, right? And so what they do is, rather than say diving into specifics of the various colony settlement, is in these documents, in these resolutions, and in the just the sort of resistance literature, they start to just talk about settlement as this general thing that happened, right? In ways that allowed them that allowed people in various colonies to adopt this rhetoric around settlement and why that matters for issues of charters and what Parliament can do and what it can't do, and so they basically just really generalize the history of settlement in a way that it could be widely adopted. And this is the beginning, I argue, of a sense of quote unquote American histories, of a sort of shared past on the part of these colonies. And it emerges during the imperial crisis as initially a rhetorical tool or a rhetorical device. But then, it continues to develop a sort of life of its own, as those things tend to do.
What does it have its limits, though? And I ask because you have this little wonderful interlude in your book where you talk about the revolutionary years yourself, where Americans begin to turn to something called natural law and defending their rights. And it got me thinking about, one of our colleagues, Grace Mallon at the University of Oxford, had a tweet that went viral a few weeks ago, in which she said, was making rightly the claim that historians develop these very complex arguments in these books based on huge amounts of evidence, where somebody like Jefferson or Washington could say, we hold these truths to be self-evident because of natural law, fight me. And so, why do they turn to natural law as opposed to what you have been seeing during the imperial crisis itself?
Yeah. So this is one of the more interesting things that I found during the research for the book. And that is, we're sort of generally taught that this idea of natural rights or natural law was an integral part of the revolution, right? But what I found, both quantitatively and qualitatively, was that natural law, natural rights arguments really only become like a prominent part of patriot rhetoric after 1772 and 1773, right? That's not to say that people in the 1760s didn't occasionally make natural law arguments. There are some, but it's not the primary argument that they're making, right? Mm-hmm. After 73, it becomes the primary, or at least one of the few primary arguments against British reform. And in the book, I sort of argue that basically what happened was, all through the 1760s, colonists are making arguments against the Stamp Act, against the Townshend Acts, and against the Tea Act, making these historical arguments. You can't do this because Parliament has never done this. You can't do this because our charter says this. And those arguments actually, when it has to do with Parliament, by the early 1770s, that argument was transforming not so much into Parliament can't do this to us, and so much as it was transforming into Parliament can't legislate for us at all, because we have these charters that were established in the 17th century with the king. So only the king has authority over the colonies. The Parliament has no jurisdiction, basically. Mm-hmm. So that was one way that they were trying to get around this the authority of Parliament and this idea of parliamentary supremacy. But also, those arguments were not making much headway, right? They were not having a big effect in persuading Parliament or even the British public generally that Parliament was in the wrong here. And this turn to natural law, what it allowed colonists to do was to stop basing their arguments as heavily on their sort of 17th century history and the history of the colonies, right, and its settlement. And instead, by adopting the rhetoric of natural law, they basically universalize all these ideas that they were arguing from before, basically saying, Parliament can't do this because of the English Constitution and because of our charters. But instead, now, once you say something is, a natural law or natural right, they're able to basically argue the same principles, but without needing the immediate historical justification. Now, that said, making an argument that something is natural law is still, in a very real sense, a historical argument, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And that's besides the fact that when you make that argument, you're basically saying, God says you can't do this, right? Or you can't do that. But it's still fundamentally a historical argument. And so natural law is a really important rhetorical tool for patriots and patriot writers to basically keep arguing the same principles, but supporting them in a different way, right? And hoping that would have some headway. It's not that they stopped believing in the authority of the past. It's more a it's more a rhetorical strategy. That's how I've come to see, the natural law, natural rights rhetoric.
Well, sure. And so then the question I think becomes, after the revolution, after independence,
Mm-hmm.
how, to borrow a phrase from another historian, how do the Americans unbecome British
Yeah.
and begin to really develop an American national history that, has its origins, as you say, in the revolution, but then it's a new ball game once you're an independent sovereign power.
Yeah. So after the war ends, this is how you know that the natural law stuff, or what suggests that the natural rights rhetoric was, was a sort of, in some sense, temporary rhetorical device, because the importance of the past does not disappear, right, after the revolution. If anything, it becomes more intense. The importance of the past, it becomes much more important, because of the situation that Americans find themselves in. Right, in 1783, they're now citizens of this new country that has a national history that goes back 8 years, right, or 7 years, and so the need for a national history for this new country was really acutely felt by a lot of people, by people that I call in the book cultural nationalists. And these were people who were committed to doing the work of establishing a new national identity for Americans that was something distinct from their previous British identities. And an important part of that was the creation of our first national history, right? If you think about it, the real challenge there is, how do you incorporate a dependent colonial past into a national history of an independent republic? Right. And they did that in a few ways. And, I should say that, chapter 4 of the book really sort of sets the stage for this post-war period by talking about how much history culture expanded, right, after the revolution, in terms of print forms and in terms of genres, right? It's after the revolution that we begin to get the first real American poetry, American fiction, and things like that. And history is really a central theme in all of these sort of emerging genres. We get more newspapers than ever before, publishing more often, and they need content, right? Get more magazines established in the 1780s and 1790s than in the entire pre-revolutionary period. And they all need content, and history and historical content, or content with historical themes, was really prominent in all of them. And they used these venues and these types of writings, in addition to histories of traditional histories, to basically reimagine this colonial past that they had, started to create before the revolution. And they reimagine it basically to look like the present, to look like the 1780s, and to highlight a few really important issues. Important in the 1780s, right? These, in the book, I talk about the issues of independence and unity, right? And basically, so I'll give you a sense of how this plays out. If you look at the first histories of the United States, or the histories of the Revolution, which often go back to settlement, so they're effectively histories of the United States, you see a focus on these two themes, independence and unity. And one of the ways that you see that is in the events that they select, to be included in these national histories. So one of those events is the siege of Louisburg in the 1740s. And this was this, colonial expedition where colonists were sent from a number of colonies, militia, with material sent from a number of colonies to go siege this French fort at Louisburg. And it was included in almost all of these first national histories. It's not an event of real, it's not an event of real historical significance in the way that we would think about it, but it showed colonists acting independently of Britain, right, and successfully. And it showed a sense of unity between the colonies because they're acting in concert with one another. And so, we see them playing up and including these types of events in these first national histories as a way of stressing, this idea of independence, because colonists Americans are trying to establish a national identity. And to do that, they need to establish some sense of cultural independence. And to do that, they need to establish some sense of historical independence, right? And in the book, I talk about how Columbus becomes the discoverer of America in 1792, right, around the tercentenary, through a collective effort of these cultural nationalists to make him that, because the history of Columbus transcends the history of England, right? And then, so it's this creation of a national history is really central to this project of creating a national identity, and it's firmly rooted in the problems and issues of the 1780s and 1790s. And so, where I said before, colonists before the Revolution, they sort of understood their present through the lens of the past. After the Revolution, that begins to change, and they start to understand the past through the lens of the present. And that's something that we recognize as a sort of more modern perspective on the past and the relationship between the past and the present.
Well, I've got a million more questions for you, but I've asked enough, and we've got some good audience questions coming in, Michael. So thanks for humoring me for a few minutes. And I love this question because actually, it gets back to some of the things we were just talking about from Andrew here. How did non-British history impact the colonists' sense of memory, and did other groups like African Americans or indigenous peoples contribute to this more universal sense of memory?
Yeah, that's a great question, Andrew. So, I mean, in terms of non-British identity, so it is the case that the colonies were a rather diverse place, relatively speaking, for the 18th century, right? And not all colonists had British origins, right, or English origins. But what I found, and I would argue that having a non-British ethnic identity did not preclude many colonists from having a British civic identity, right? So you could, if you're a settler in the colonies from if you're a Scotch-Irish settler in the colonies, if you're a French Huguenot, if you're, from some principality in what we now think of as Germany, you could retain, large parts of your ethnic identity, and yet still develop this civic identity, this British civic identity. And so those two did not clash necessarily as much as you might expect. And part of that has to do with the fact that British civic identity in the 18th century, at least among the white population, is seen as a very positive thing, right? Relative to, say, being from France or or some other place, maybe, or from Spain for that matter, and that is primarily because of Britain's post-Glorious Revolution history, right? That's what informs the identity, even for non-British subjects. I talk in the book about the ways in which slavery is discussed and African Americans are discussed in these histories. And to make a long story short, they're basically not. I mean, slavery is shockingly absent from many of these earliest histories of the United States. And the example that I always give, I talk about in the book, is James Daly Burke, who was this Irish immigrant who had sort of a political dissident from Ireland. He wrote the first state history of Virginia after the Revolution, 3 volumes of the history of Virginia that he wrote, covering all of the 17th century. And you could count the mentions of slavery on one hand, right? and you would wonder, how can you talk about, the development of the largest slave society in North America at the time, and without talking about slavery or enslaved persons? But they absolutely did it, and they did not. There was not a lot of pushback, and part of what's strange about that is, a number of these cultural nationalists, especially from the North in New England and in the Middle colonies, a number of them were, developing very strong anti-slavery perspectives in the 1780s, 90s, and 1800s. And yet, there's in their writings where they criticize the institution, they have no words to criticize its absence in these histories, right? In the book too, I would say, I want to give a chance for some other questions, but there, a big part of chapter 6 talks about how early national Americans engaged with, and I argue appropriated, the indigenous histories of not just of Native Americans, but also of the continent itself. And that's part of creating a sense of, a sense of the past, of a deep national past that could also sort of transcend Britain and give them a sense of historical independence. And so part of how they did that was basically to claim that the nation, that the principles of the nation were embedded in the soil of the continent, right? And in that way, they effectively made these weird analogies to indigenous populations, by basically appropriating the histories for themselves and their nationalist purposes.
Well, thanks very much, Andrew. It's a great question, and
Yeah.
we've got another one coming in that actually gets back to that question of what people were reading and thinking about. And this question asks, these days we've got plays like Hamilton, and it's actually a wonderful play on the treason trial of Aaron Burr, actually, which is quite fascinating. And that helped us inform our sense of the 18th century, where people at the time reading similar works or doing similar things to help design their ideas about the past.
Yeah. So part of the challenge of looking at history culture in the 18th century is that it's not until the very end of the 18th century that we begin to see a lot of historical cultural production, I call it, right? And that's just any sort of cultural work that uses historical themes, like a play, say, or historical fiction or whatnot. There's not a lot of that before the Revolution at all, and it's really those types of cultural forms and genres emerge after the Revolution, right? So we don't have the we don't have the breadth of sources that, say, someone studying the history culture of the United States in the 20th century would have, right? But we do have the beginnings of some of those things. Like, so in the book, I talk about the creation of the first natural history museums, right? And their role in, perpetuating this idea of a deep national past and of sort of co-opting the land for nationalist purposes. So we begin to see what I call the institutionalization of history culture. So we get the first historical societies in the 1790s and the decade or two after that. So the first museums, the first natural history museums, the first historical societies, and we see a real explosion in these new cultural forms. And like I said before, history is central in all of them. In the first, some of the first and most popular fiction written after the Revolution is historical fiction, and including one book by Susanna Rowson that's a sort of historical fiction of Columbus and his descendants who end up in America, right? And this plays into the theme I was talking about before. But even in poetry, in plays, a lot of plays from the 1790s to the 18 teens, that explore various historical events. So, we start to see those things. And what I was interested in looking at those kind of things in this period was to see how much they reflected some of the ideas that I was seeing in the actual histories, right? To get a sense of, if you just write an interpretation of the past and it's just in one book, that's not creating a historical memory, right? That's just a book. That's just an interpretation. For something to be considered or to start thinking of something as historical memory, you really have to see it in lots of places. You have to see, say a similar interpretation being used in lots of places, being used for the same purpose, right? The same argumentative or rhetorical, political purpose, and also when you see it being used in different forms, right? So whether it's in, manifesting itself in some poem or some play or whatever, or some work of fiction, and that's how then you can begin to think, in terms of historical memory, and I found an awful lot of that.
Terrific. Well, thanks so much for that question. We've got another one coming in that actually is very fascinating from Niles. Given what you say about the erosion of historically established rights, how much is the American Revolution really the American Restoration?
That's a great question. In fact, so in the book, there is an image of a historical chart that was created by David Ramsey, who was one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent, historian of the Revolution in the United States before the Civil War, up until George Bancroft. And in his History of the Revolution that he wrote in the 1780s, he makes this argument that the Revolution was basically fought to preserve or recover lost rights, right? As opposed to trying to establish something brand new, right? And this goes back to this idea of, rethinking the Glorious Revolution, because in his historical chart, you can see he has a very strict dividing line between what he called free government and the end of free government, right in 1688 and 1689, right? So the idea, and that map is from 1810, and he wrote his History of the Revolution in the 1780s, right? So it gives you a sense that interpretation was not something that was, just an expedient for the moment in the imperial crisis, or even just after the revolution, but really, really hung around. And part of the reason for that interpretation of his this is an example of just how enmeshed the ways that people thought about history during the revolution were sort of interrelated with the politics of the period. If we think about the 1780s, you think about Shays' Rebellion, in the 1790s, you think about the Whiskey Rebellion, or Freeze Rebellion. There's a lot of unrest, and there's a lot of dissent against the new state and federal governments in the decades just after the revolution. And in a lot of those cases, especially in Shays' Rebellion in the 1780s in Massachusetts, you have the situation where you have these West farmers who are basically rebelling against the state government, and many of them are veterans of the Continental Army, right? And they're adopting a lot of the rhetoric of the revolution to support their cause, right? And so this conservative approach, interpretation of the revolution as being about regaining something rather than creating something new, is partly inspired by these like the Constitution itself was, by these rebellions, and by a broader sense of a need to sort of make the past less co-optable by the discontented, as it were, right? And so the revolution gets portrayed as a restoration, as it were, in Neil's terms, rather than the product of some spontaneous radical uprising like these rebellions were. It is the case that many Americans understood the revolution in those terms, but also at the same time, many Americans, like the farmers who were rebelling and many who didn't rebel, they saw the revolution as an opening, right? And spent the 1780s calling for many democratic reforms that were not part of the original spirit of 76, right? So we see both of those aspects, and that's something that stayed with us and stayed a sort of permanent part of how we treat the revolution in our political culture, right? The revolution is interesting in a sense, in a history of memory sense, because it can so easily be co-opted by groups that are totally the opposite of one another, right? Abolitionists in the 1840s can claim the legacy of the revolution, and pro-slavery Confederates in the 1860s can claim the legacy of the revolution, right? And that conservative / radical dynamic has been a part of how we've fought over the revolution and the meaning of the revolution ever since then.
Well, thank you very much, Niles. And let's go ahead and complete this revolution and return to first principles with
There we go.
Margot's final question here. Where did the idea for this book originate?
Oh, that's a great question. So it's the germ of it came from a paper I wrote as an older non-traditional undergraduate student, where I was looking at the founding of King's College in New York City, which ultimately became Columbia University, and there was a fight over the founding of that college between Anglicans and non-Anglicans, what they would call dissenters, in the 1750s in New York City. And it was a very heated debate. And I noticed that they were using lots of terminology to describe one another, that came from the 17th century, like, Whig and Tory. Those are 17th century. Those are terms from 17th century political history in England, referring to having an Anglican refer to some dissenting leader as a Cromwell or a Leveler, right? And so I started to think that it was interesting to see this, and that I would like to explore more, how the way that people thought about the British past shaped politics in the colonies. And originally I thought it was going to go up to about 1776, but then I was doing some research early on at the New York Historical Society, and I found this manuscript by David Ramsay of his the first 6 chapters of his History of the Revolution. And in that manuscript, after I was able to identify it because it was wrongly identified, I noticed that in the first chapter, what he did was he had in the draft, he has a long sort of disquisition where he talks about the history of Britain of England in the 17th century, the Civil Wars, the Glorious Revolution, and all that. But then when I compared it to the published version, that got cut out, and it's like replaced with sort of individual histories of the colonies' sort of early settlement and development. And seeing that the changes in that manuscript, really sort of raised the question that's at the heart of the book itself, which is, when did colonists stop thinking of the British past as their history and create what we think of as quote unquote American history, right? And so it was really that manuscript, sort of seeing the changes in it, that effectively gave me the question that structures the book. And I really think that the book is about the creation of what we think of as American history. And the lesson there is that it's something that was constructed. American history was constructed. The geographical boundaries, the temporal boundaries, the chronological boundaries, all of that was set by choices made by the revolutionary generation, right? And in many ways, many Americans still think of quote unquote American history on those terms that were set in the 1790s, right? So it's had a really long impact, a really significant role in shaping what we think of as quote unquote American history. And that's why, that's a big part of its significance for me.
Golly, what a find. I'm super jealous that you got to see that. Well, Margot, thanks so much for the question. Michael, this has been terrific. Thanks so much for taking the time, coming to us from the land of Lincoln. It's been a real treat.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim.
Oh, it's our pleasure. And folks, once again, the book is Past in Prologue. Please do pick up a copy wherever you enjoy getting books. Want to thank you all for joining us this evening. It's been a real delight to have you as always. And thanks again to Jeanette Patrick and Samantha Snyder for running things behind the scenes. Couldn't have done it without you. Michael, great to see you. Hope to see you back soon, and we'll work on that next book.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everyone.
Good night.